Downing Street has accused Elon Musk of spreading dangerous and inflammatory language at a protest organized by far-right activist Tommy Robinson. Number 10 said rhetoric used by the tech billionaire over the weekend threatened violence and intimidation on Britain's streets. The owner of Tesla and X told demonstrators at the rally in London to fight back or die. He also called for an urgent change in government in the UK and told a crowd that violence is coming in a guest appearance at the protest on Saturday. The Prime Minister's official spokesman said, "The UK is a fair, tolerant, and decent country. The last thing the British people want is this sort of dangerous and inflammatory language." He said it threatened violence and intimidation on our streets, adding, "I don't think the British public will have any truck with that kind of language." It is not the first time the Tesla boss has waded into British politics. He previously used his X social media platform to start a war of words with the government over grooming gangs in the UK. Sir Keir Starmer condemned the use of the flag as a symbol of violence, fear, and division in a statement at the weekend. He said the right to peaceful protest was core to British values, but that he would not stand for assaults on police officers doing their job or for people feeling intimidated on our streets because of their background or the color of their skin. "Britain is a nation proudly built on tolerance, diversity, and respect," Sir Keir said. "Our flag represents our diverse country, and we will never surrender it to those that use it as a symbol of violence, fear, and division." Between 110,000 and 150,000 people turned out for the protest on Saturday, significantly exceeding the estimates of organizers. Some 26 police officers were injured, including 4 who were seriously hurt, and 24 people were arrested for a range of offenses including affray, violent disorder, assault, and criminal damage. Asked about the language on Monday, Mr. Farage said the context in which the words had been used left a degree of ambiguity. If the fight that Musk was talking about was about standing up for our rights and free speech, if it was about fighting in elections to overcome the established parties, then that absolutely is the fight that we're in, he said. Keir Starmer, before dawn, the morning after the march. The glow from his phone showed a string of briefings, wires, and the terse messages ministers send when the world has tilted on its axis. The Unite the Kingdom March had not been meant to morph into the kind of national drama that drenched the front pages. It was supposed to be another demonstration on a late summer Saturday. Instead, it had become a moment that would not only test police patience and the stamina of emergency services, but also the brittle boundaries of public rhetoric and the Prime Minister's steadiness. He sat up and listened. Outside, the city was beginning to stir, the clatter of early buses, the muffled shouts of a man sweeping a shopfront. The headlines already pulsed in his head. "Violence is coming," a voice had told the mass on Saturday. "Fight back or die." Words like flint and tinder. Words that, once thrown into a crowd, will not always fall harmlessly to the ground. Keir pulled on a sweater and glanced at the framed text on his mantelpiece, a passage about the rule of law and the duty of a leader not only to speak, but to hold. He had become practiced in steadiness, the years in court, the nights reading statutes, the slow accretion of a reputation as someone who thought before he spoke. Tonight, the thought that mattered was simple and sharp. Words have consequences. In Downing Street, the morning moved quickly. Briefings came in as little bundles of facts, numbers, hospital updates, statements from the Metropolitan Police, dozens injured, scores arrested, scenes of clashes that had left even hardened command officers shaken. The crowd estimates varied wildly depending on the source. Some put the turnout over 100,000. Journalists in the garden were already forming their scripts. Ministers wanted to posture, to show resolve. Others counseled restraint. The real pressure was not just in the tally of injuries. For weeks, the debate about immigration had thinned public life into 2 brittle arguments, neither of them satisfying, both of them loud. The rally had been less about policy and more about identity. Banners fluttered. Flags were hoisted, symbols remade into talismans. And in that charged atmosphere, a tech billionaire had stepped into the frame via a grainy live link and let his words loosen like a hand grenade. Dangerous, the number 10 statement said. Inflammatory, the language was measured, aligned to the Prime Minister's instincts, but the consequence of such rhetoric was not soft, and the public mood required more than bland distance. Keir felt that acutely. He imagined, with a slow dread, someone in a small town seeing the clip, feeling braced and angrier. The climate for violence eased. He thought of the officers injured in riot gear, of the families who would read of the injured and be frightened. The Prime Minister's office had prepared lines that morning. The right to peaceful protest is a cornerstone of British democracy, But freedom of speech is not freedom from consequence when it tips into the language of intimidation. He practiced the phrasing in the mirror, the same way he worked a paragraph for court. The difference here was the audience. Millions would listen, judge, and make up their minds from a few seconds of sound and black and white footage posted on a social platform. Walking down the corridor to the press room felt like stepping into a bright trench. Cameras blinked. Reporters had already primed their taglines and their takes. Keir did not like to theatrically slow his pace. Theater cheapens the work of office. But this morning, every step felt heavy. He began carefully. "Britain is a fair, tolerant, and decent country," he said, and the words landed like a pledge. He spoke of the flag, the symbol that can mean different things to different people, and he said plainly that it must not be co-opted by those who would use it to intimidate. He said he would not stand by when officers were injured doing their jobs, nor when people felt unsafe because of their background or skin color. There was a further line he had to deliver, and he did so without flourish. "We will not surrender our identity to those who traffic in fear." The media immediately picked that up. The sentence engraved neatly into the feeds. Later, when the cameras were gone, a cluster of aides gathered around him. The conversations were mercifully, necessarily pragmatic. One aide pointed to the legal analysis. The threshold for criminal liability in speech was high. Experts said Musk's words, for all their danger, probably did not cross the legal line. That fact, plausible as it was, left a political problem. If the law is a thin reed, what then is the remedy? Sanctions? Contract cancellations? The Treasury desk had already been asked to look at procurement risk. Keir folded his hands. He wanted to show righteous anger, but he also knew that governments wield sanctions badly and rarely without unintended harm. He also understood the nuance that many in his party failed to grasp. A democracy that commits itself to free expression must be careful not to slide into censorship in the name of safety. Yet neither could it be complacent when a voice with global reach urged a crowd to embrace violence. Outside, the city was digesting images. Clips of the speech looped across timelines, each replay altering the context slightly. Some viewers heard a call to civic engagement, others heard a call to arms. Nigel Farage, in a brief interview, suggested the phrase's context left room for ambiguity, a helpful gray for some, an irresponsible dodge for others. The left cried incitement. The right asked whether condemnation didn't itself feed grievance. Keir read those takes with the same clinician's eye he brought to cross-examination. He knew what the politics would be. The conservative benches would howl about bias, some opposition leaders would call for full sanction, and the newspapers would choose their frames along established lines. But the job before him wasn't to win the narrow narrative clash. It was to tend to the public good, which sometimes required unglamorous work. Meetings with police chiefs, outreach to community leaders, ensuring hospitals were coping, and reinforcements were ready if further unrest followed. In the afternoon, he visited a small East London police station where officers had worked through the night. The station smelled like coffee and paper. Men and women in tired uniforms leaned back on chairs, their faces mapped by bruises and exhaustion. Keir walked among them quietly, accepting terse thanks and the occasional cynic's glare. He knew the cameras would like the image, leader among the stoic, but he also wanted the officers to see that public office could be present and not performative. One sergeant, a woman with a neat bun and the look of someone who had seen more than she should, spoke to him plainly. "We are trained for crowd control," she said. "We're not trained for being publicly vilified in a viral clip. It changes how people treat us. It changes how they might act on a Saturday afternoon. That's the worry." Her words were the kind that stay with a man who has spent his career weighing words. By late afternoon, the legal teams had sent another briefing. There were risks in making punitive moves against a figure as globally prominent as Elon Musk. Trade, investment, and technological cooperation could be affected. There was also the danger of being portrayed as authoritarian. The calculus was awkward. Preserve openness and risk inflaming those already primed, or punish and risk being accused of silencing dissent. Keir stepped back and thought of the ledger we keep as a society. On one side, civility, tolerance, and the rule of law. On the other, the raw energy of protest, sometimes righteous, sometimes menacing. It was not a ledger that balanced easily. A decision was made: condemnation in public, investigation, and tight oversight behind closed doors. No knee-jerk sanctions. Instead, a referral to the proper authorities to determine whether any laws had been broken, and stronger cooperation with the platforms that served as the new public squares. The Prime Minister wanted to send a message without collapsing into theatrical vindictiveness. He believed the state should be the steady hand, not the vengeful fist. And then there was the personal calculus. Keir kept thinking of an email he had received from a constituent that morning, a teacher who wrote about how her pupils, many of them children of migrants, had come to school that week shaken by the images. They asked if the country was still safe, she wrote. I could only say I hoped so. Leaders speak in abstractions, but responsibility sits in the small ways too, in a teacher's answer to a child. As dusk fell, he read the counsel of the party's veterans, those who had learned the price of high rhetoric. They advised a focus on healing and clarity, reaffirmed the country's commitment to diversity, promised to protect minority communities, and avoid stoking a reaction that could be weaponized. He liked the counsel. He was, after all, forged in the detail of argument. Clarity was oxygen to him. But the headwinds were a reminder that politics now takes place in a landscape where words are currency, convertible into outrage, into grief, into the kind of action the law sometimes struggles to foresee. Elon Musk's message had not only traveled across an internet platform, it had been transmuted in the mouths of thousands, and that mutability made it unpredictable. A phrase spoken into a microphone could become a story that animated people across the country. And while many would interpret it as metaphor, others would hear a literal call. That night, in the privacy of his small study, Keir allowed himself a rare indulgence. He read, not reports, not briefings, but a history essay about the fragile civic bonds that hold republics together. The passage that lingered told of how leaders, in moments of rhetorical crescendo, have sometimes chosen easy linguistics that were satisfying in the sound of them, only to regret the consequences when unrest followed. It was not a new lesson. It was one written and rewritten across centuries. Yet here, in the modern age of virality, the lesson felt unfamiliar in its speed. He dreamed, briefly, of a street where a woman in a headscarf and her daughter could pass a banner without the daughter fearing what it represented to another man. He dreamed of the quiet dignity of a police officer, tired but safe, able to clock off after a shift without images of mobs chasing them across his screen. Dreams are a kind of instruction, too. They are what tether a person to a sense of what should be. The next day, the debate in Parliament was raw and swift. Opponents seized on language. Some demanded dramatic action. Others urged calm. Keir's speech was blunt but controlled. He would not allow the nation's identity to be captured by fear, nor would he allow the flames of rhetoric to feed into real-world harm. He read the list of the injured officers and vouched for an impartial inquiry into the events, including any public figures who might have used language that could be interpreted as incitement. Outside, a clutch of teenagers chanted in the square and waved placards that braided anger into a strange and shifting pattern. Some were sincere, some were hardlier. Keir watched from the steps, aware that in modern Britain the public square was a stage on which people performed their deepest grievances. He also knew the history, the unfortunate pattern of how a single line, shouted in a moment of fervor, can set a new normal. In the months that followed, the story did not finish neatly. Investigations came. Legal opinions were issued that found the threshold for criminal sanction unmet in the case of the billionaire's speech. A public conversation about platform responsibility gained heat. But the civil work, the steady repairs, continued to matter most. Officers treated, tensions calmed in neighborhoods where local leaders convened, and political leaders of all stripes pressed for clearer, less incendiary language. Keir would sometimes, late at night in the weeks after, replay his words in the mirror. He did not crave applause. He wanted something else. The slow work of building a language for the nation that neither allowed intimidation nor fell into curbing legitimate protest. He wanted a Britain where symbols brought people together, not drove them apart. When, in a quiet moment months later, he visited the school where the teacher had written to him, he found children drawing flags and talking about what it meant to belong. The teacher greeted him with a tired smile. They still ask questions, she said. That will never stop. But they also draw pictures of people holding hands, and sometimes that is the best answer we can give. The scene was small, domestic, ordinary, the exact kind of thing public life is meant to protect. In the end, the episode became a test not only of legal boundaries, but of the ethos of a nation. It was a reminder that leadership asks for language that is brave yet careful, bluntness without madness, moral clarity without a rush to moral retribution. He had chosen to call out the rhetoric as dangerous. He had chosen to protect the institutions and the people who made the everyday life of the country possible. On a crisp morning, months after the march, Keir walked past a memorial for those lost in a different era. He paused, thinking of the small obligations that stitch a nation together. The polite nod to a stranger, the quiet dignity of an officer doing her duty, the teacher who soothes a child's fears. He thought of language as a public instrument, and of the need to treat it with a kind of respect one pays to other shared resources. He had been tested, so had the country, and the test had left marks. But in another, more private sense, it had done something else too. It had reminded him why he had taken the job in the first place, to keep in stubborn ways the fragile, ordinary good of public life intact. Outside, the city resumed its rhythm. Somewhere, a social clip continued to loop, and the debates would not entirely disappear. But inside classrooms and on quiet streets, life went on, stubbornly ordinary, and perhaps that ordinariness was the real thing to defend.